you, Kim. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being here. Good morning. All right, I'd like to introduce to you actually two things. One is this very exciting and diverse market for coffee, which is the Israeli market. And the second thing is the notion of the glocal. And I'd like to show you how different actors integrate local elements into a global movement to expand the reach of specialty coffee and connect consumers to it by tapping into their cultural identities. But first, I want to tell you how I got there, theoretically and also physically. And to do this, I'll take you on a journey from Israel, through France, and Brazil, and back. So I grew up in a coffee shop. Well, not literally grew up in a coffee shop. I grew up in front of a coffee shop. It was a place called Café Tamal in Tel Aviv, and it was a mythological venue. It hosted artists and intellectuals and poets from the 1940s, and I would go there with my dad as a 3-year-old to munch on the butts of croissants. And this place wasn't really about coffee. It was more about this bohemian, Tel Avivian, unique vibe. And when 20 years later, I moved to Paris, I spent all of my time in coffee shops there too. But it wasn't like these bohemian, traditional, Parisian cafes. I was spending all of my time in specialty coffee shops. This was 2013, and the third wave of coffee was institutionalizing in France. And these places felt to me like home because they too were global. They had this very specific look and feel, one that was catering to the middle, upper class, cosmopolitan, urban creatives that were looking to consume this kind of globalized aesthetic of authenticity. Whether it was Brooklyn-style exposed brick walls, or tropical plants, or this kind of pure white raw wood Scandi-style cafes. And as I was looking for a new subject for the PhD that I wanted to pursue in sociology, I thought about the vibes and aesthetics of these places, and I wondered, how come these places all look the same? Whether they're in Paris or Tokyo or Sao Paulo or Istanbul, how do vibes and aesthetic travel globally? How are they commodified, or as my PhD advisor called it, how do they become immodities, emotional commodities, or commodified emotional experiences? But honestly, I didn't really find an interesting explanation to these themes that hasn't already been suggested before. So what I did is I took a deep dive into fieldwork in France and in Brazil. And then I realized the power of the local. Now, initially, the third wave in France, or the pioneers of it, had a very strong Anglo-Saxon influence in both menu and design. Now, this of course makes sense, because as the pioneers begin this new movement, they want to signal to consumers that this is not your traditional Parisian cafe with its little petit noir, that this is a taste of revolution that may have started elsewhere but is now transforming the local scene. But as the third wave was catching on and expanding in France, roasters and cafe owners were looking for new ways to leverage local tradition, to leverage nostalgia in the past to create aesthetic and symbolic value that would serve as a means and justification to justify economic value as well. So some, like Belleville Brûlerie, bought old bistros and make them into specialty coffee shops. They also rebranded filter coffee, considered a sock juice in France, jus de chaussette, and they also made a traditional French roast, but using specialty coffee beans. Well, others, like Terre de Café, turned more to the wine world. Terre de Café sell Grand Cru coffees and use the allocation system. And others still, like Lomi, for example, a French roaster, worked with Brazilian farms like Da Terra to apply methods from the wine world, specifically Méthode Beaujolais, to green coffee from the Lorena or Bourbon Pointu variety. So to stay in Brazil, there too, I noticed that producers were leveraging and using this kind of originally French, but now globalized language system of terroir, but to designate the uniqueness of the local. The two regions that I did my fieldwork in, Caparaó and the Cerrado Mineiro, both applied for protected designation of origin for their coffees, meaning that they were using these globalized systems of laws and meaning, but to designate the uniqueness of the local and the regional. So, I was seeing really interesting things happening in this meeting between the local and the global. I was realizing that producers in France and in Brazil were connecting to consumers by, on the one hand, tapping into their identities as global and connected and traveling, but on the other hand, also understanding these consumers' desire to experience the local, the historical, the natural, the artisanal, the regional. So these producers were leveraging different meanings of authentic coffee. Coffee that was traveling, but also rooted in local traditions. Coffee that was place-based, but was also global. We call this in research glocalization, or glocal, the meeting of the global and the local, or in our case, the integration of local elements into the global or Anglo, to be honest, movement. And social scientists have been doing very extensive research trying to explain the cultural impacts of globalization. Some have focused on the homogenizing effect of cultural and economic cores on peripheries. We call this the world system theory. Others looked more at processes of hybridization or negotiation between the two. And others still really emphasized the frictions or the resistance between the global and the local. So I was using this new framework to look at what I was observing at France and in Brazil, and I was starting to write these ideas into my PhD. But then, COVID happened, and life happened. And I found myself very suddenly moving back to Israel. And I came back to a golden age of coffee. Everyone was talking about coffee. The media was talking about coffee, and not just cafes opening or closing during COVID quarantines. They were talking about coffee history and coffee science. And coffee tech companies were popping up too. It was part of this bigger food tech trend in Israel, exporting technological solutions to farmers in Brazil and to offices in the United States. More and more people are getting into coffee growing, as you can see behind me. This is one of them, Ram Ivgi. We have even a local variety called Golda. And the third wave of coffee was also catching on and expanding, mostly in Tel Aviv. Now in Israel too, specialty coffee is an imported model, Anglo, global, and there too, actors are integrating more local, traditional elements into their venues. For example, introducing Turkish-style coffees into third-wave cafes. Now, Turkish-style coffee is extremely popular in Israel, but mostly under its instant form. Well, traditionally, it's made using this tool, an ibrick. So this third-wave Scandi-style coffee shop, House of Coffee, started serving their La Cabra coffee, made the Turkish style, in an ibrick cooked over hot sand. Another example, much like in Paris, would be opting more for coffee shop design to leverage nostalgia. For example, this place, Nachat, kind of harkened the architectural historical style of Bauhaus associated with Tel Aviv's oldest cafes. And they also use fonts similar to those used in cafes like the one I grew up in, Café Tamal. So far, similar to Paris, but there was something interesting that I noticed happening in Israel, which was that actors weren't only integrating the local through visual cues or cafe menus. They were embarking on this quest, and through a number of initiatives, were really expanding the reach of specialty coffee and connecting it in very interesting ways to the unique history and diversity of local coffee consumption. Now, Israel is a pretty young country, but coffee is not new to it. It arrived to the region as early as the 16th century through the Ottoman Empire, and it quickly became immensely popular, in large part due to the Muslim ban on the consumption of wine. So the Museum of Islamic Arts in Jerusalem decided to tell this story recently in an exhibition called Coffee, East to West, and I was the co-editor of the exhibition book. In it, a group of coffee shop owners, social scientists, coffee historians, and even coffee machine makers told the local story of coffee from the very diverse and interesting coffee culture that emerged in Palestine through the arrival of the more European cafe model with the Jewish immigrants that came to Israel. They brought with them these cafes and also not so great filter coffee. We moved on to the kind of cementing of the Zionist identity and national project through a very interesting industry of ceramic and porcelain coffeeware in a style that was called Israeliana, a take on Americana. We saw how these European-style cafes replaced some of the more traditional Arab cafes when the owners of these places had to flee the country after the 1948 war. And we continue to describe the very diverse coffee culture of the different groups and ethnicities that exist in Israel today, which leads me to my next point. Israel still is extremely diverse in terms of coffee culture and consumption. It's a very diverse country ethnically, and each of these groups have their own coffee beverages, coffee traditions, and different meanings attributed to coffee as well. So, for example, Israel has a significant Ethiopian Jewish population. They have their own unique beverages. The Maui will serve some later on, I think. And they, of course, have the coffee ritual of the buna, accompanied by designated tools. Yemen, from which many Jews also immigrated to Israel, of course, have gisher, you might know it as cascara, the infusion of coffee cherry husks. And they also have a drink called white coffee, which is coffee, lightly roasted, mixed with ground grains and a spice mix called chawayej. But unfortunately, most Israelis are not really aware of these beverages and of this diversity. Actually, most Israelis consume at home instant coffee, a local brand of Nescafe, followed by Turkish-style coffee, but again, a sort of instant version of it, capsules, and then beans. But when we zoom in into the Palestinian, Arab, Israeli population, we see very interesting shifts and trends. So Palestinian, Arab, Israelis mostly consume Turkish-style or Turkish coffee as well. But there's something interesting happening in Arabic cities like Taibe, Tira, and Kalansawa. In these cities, espresso drinks are becoming immensely popular, and dozens of coffee shops are popping up buying blends composed of 80 to 100% Arabica and roasted locally. And something similar is happening in the south of the country, in Bedouin villages, where cappuccino has become a very popular drink. It's made differently, from 18 to 20 grams of coffee, ground very coarsely, but still there is an indication that something is moving and something is happening there. Now, many people would not think of Bedouin villages as your typical or potential specialty coffee consumer, but consumption trends indicate a desire and an interest in coffee culture and consumption. And so do our encounters. So a few months ago, we had Tel Aviv's first coffee fest, and there we met people from all over the country, from small villages who came to the festival to share the passion and the knowledge for a drink that has been part of their history, daily life, and culture. I also met some of these people in the courses that I teach about coffee history, culture, and economy. The people that signed up to these courses were anything from avocado and truffle farmers through entrepreneurs and lawyers to people, again, from small villages who came to value this beverage together and share and participate in the treasures of knowledge that the third wave creates and curates. Now, the third wave of coffee is very, very focused and passionate about education and research. And this is great, and we'd love to see the interest in local culture and history continue, not becoming co-optation. I think that we can expand the reach of this research and this education beyond just coffee professionals and beyond the middle, upper class, cosmopolitan, urban consumers. So let us transform this knowledge into acknowledgement and into connections. Thank you so much for joining this journey. Have a great day.